Today on With the First Pick, we're going around the league and hitting some minicamp storylines. Aaron Rodgers and Nick Chubb, they have new teams. Anthony Richardson is injured again. Which teams are in the market for Jaire Alexander and Jalen Ramsey? We'll answer those questions, and we'll also answer some mailbag questions later in the show. I'm Ryan Wilson. That's former Titans GM Rand Carthon. And Rand, this is episode 268, and while I know you may not care, there's some draft sickos out there who do. There are 317 days until the 2026 NFL Draft in Pittsburgh, PA. And by the way, just a reminder, we've got a little summer series that'll make you smarter. That's what we're calling Carthon's Corner, where we talk with some of the brightest people in and around the league. If you missed it, we had our conversation with Browns GM Andrew Berry and Jags GM James Gladstone about the Travis Hunter trade. That's in the old podcast feed. And yesterday, had a chat with Rand's former boss, Rams GM Les Need. That is live as well right now. We'll be rolling out more episodes throughout June, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of them. Rand, how you doing?
Man, I'm good, man. I'm just, trudging along this summer, dropping kids off at summer camp and, everything else. But, I've been excited. It's been cool to do the, this series, the summer series is what I'm going to call it.
Carthon's Corner.
Just get some insightful people in and, appreciate Les, appreciate, James and Andrew for doing it with us so far. And got some cool ones coming, so stay tuned.
Absolutely have some cool ones coming. And just to reiterate, we set podcast history by having two GMs on at the same time and a third GM if you include Rand. I'm the GM of this podcast, so we literally had four GMs on the show at one time, Rand. How about that? All right, let's get to some OTA minicamp storylines because there's not a lot else going on. And before you know it, the season will be back. And we'll be doing our summer scouting series in a few weeks, probably in July. So look forward to that if you can't wait to talk about some of these upcoming college players. But for now, let's start with someone who's in our age bracket. He'll be getting these AARP cards around the same time we do. Aaron Rodgers finally signed his deal. Not a surprise that he's going to Pittsburgh, but what are the expectations? Because I'll just say this. I went back and looked because everyone is hoping, fingers crossed, hope isn't a plan, but they're hoping that you get a version of Aaron Rodgers that's similar to what Tom Brady brought to Tampa Bay when they won that Super Bowl in 2021. And I went back and looked, and over the second half of last season, week 10 to week 18, Russ Wilson, and the Steelers lost 5 games towards the end of that season. Russ Wilson, when he started for the Steelers, and what Aaron Rodgers did for the Jets over those final 9 games or so, literally identical. Same completion percentage, same average yards down the field and air yards, touchdowns, interception ratio was very similar. So is this a huge upgrade over what Russ brought Pittsburgh last year?
I'm not going to say a huge upgrade, but again, regardless of how you see it and what you think about him, he will be a Hall of Famer, first ballot Hall of Famer at that. And he's one of the most talented quarterbacks to come through. I think, for me, the big part that I want to see is how is he going to acclimate to a new offense that he doesn't have any history with, right? So he chooses the Jets because Nathaniel Hackett is there. And they have a good working relationship, and he has input and a say. Well, he's never worked with Arthur Smith before. And what is that going to be like working in an offense? And Arthur has his offense and his offensive system. And is he going to give, Aaron Rodgers some autonomy to have a say? Now, again, all quarterback coaches, all offensive coordinators allows the quarterback to give you input on the first 15 and certain things that they like or dislike about the game plan. But as we've seen, whether it was Green Bay or whether it was with the Jets, like Aaron Rodgers had a big say-so in what they were going to do. And I think that was some of the initial headbutt, with Matt LaFleur and Aaron Rodgers when they first got there together.
Right. And Matt LaFleur has a track record of being pretty successful in terms of dialing up plays, both before he got to Green Bay and now after Aaron Rodgers has left. And it's interesting that you mentioned that because I think Arthur Smith a little bit, and, he's the OC for my Pittsburgh Steelers. But I want to go back to Nick Haley, who, the OC in Tennessee. And I mentioned that because you said he's, as a young OC, he understands what it means to have a young quarterback and getting input there. When you have two grizzled old-timers, in the sense of Arthur Smith and Aaron Rodgers, could there be an opportunity for friction pretty early on if one of these guys doesn't want to give?
Yeah, it could. And then you think about with Arthur's also been a head coach, so that's a whole different dynamic and a whole different, aspect of leadership. Now, speaking out of both sides of my mouth, that could also help Arthur in terms of understanding how to manage the roster, having had done that before in different personalities. So that could help. But then again, Aaron Rodgers is in his 40s. He's used to doing things a certain way. And you just wonder if Arthur Smith is going to be willing to put in some things that are, Aaron's used to doing in the offense and things that he likes to do. So we'll see how it works out. I think in the grand scheme of things, you still have, Mike Tomlin there to kind of manage the overarching, piece of it. And he's done it before and he's had big personalities. I'm sure it wasn't easy managing Big Ben earlier on, but they somehow made it work. So we'll see how this whole thing shapes out with all those guys there in Pittsburgh.
Right. And I think whatever happens, whether they win the Super Bowl or they win one game, they're going to be in the market for a quarterback. And that's certainly something we'll be addressing in the coming weeks and months as we do the summer scouting. All right, let's stay in Pittsburgh and let's talk about TJ Watt, because he's not at minicamp and, he wants a new deal and he's going to get a new deal. And the thing that they keep coming back to, and I think the Steelers will probably take care of TJ Watt, that's not the real concern, but the ancillary storyline for me, Rand, is that as the Cowboys, at least from the outside looking in, continue to drag their feet, the price of Micah Parsons just keep going up, because I would imagine TJ's going to get done before Micah, and that's going to cost the Cowboys a few extra $1 million on the back end. But in terms of TJ Watt, who's 30 years old, still elite, one of the best players in the NFL, not just pass rushers, are we paying him $35 to $40 million a year?
You better. Because if you don't, someone else will. Right, just for that reason. And I like what you just said. Not only is he one of the best pass rushers, but he's one of the best players, in our league as well. And as you see on the graphic, since 2017, all those guys that are beneath him, they're all in that 30 number. I think Daniel Hunter's close to it, but all those guys got to that 30 number, so why not him? He's such a key component of this defense and of this team and what it means to be a Pittsburgh Steeler. So it's really in the part that you hit about Micah Parsons and him both wanting a deal at the same time, it's really a game of chicken for both of those organizations, both of these players and the people that represent them. So it's a game of chicken to see who's going to blink first. And I can almost guarantee you whichever one signs first, the other is going to probably beat them by 0.1, $100,000 to be the highest paid player. I remember a time when we were in San Francisco and Trent Williams was looking for a new deal. And his deal, I think at the time, Eric Bakhtiari was the highest paid offensive lineman in the league, and I think Trent's deal beat it by like 10,000. It was such a ridiculously low number that Bakhtiari tweeted him that he was petty for even having that deal done. So it's going to happen again here with Micah Parsons and TJ Watt.
If you're Micah Parsons' agent, for example, you may not be in a hurry, right? You might be willing to just sort of slow play this to see how TJ Watt, his deal unfolds, because it'll probably get done at least by training camp, and then you're making your client a few extra bucks. Does that sound reasonable?
Of course it sounds reasonable. And again, Micah Parsons is younger. So, yeah. It gives you even more leverage in the negotiation, because Pittsburgh is negotiating with a 30-year-old, and this is his third deal. And this is just Micah's deal coming off of his rookie year. So it gives you more leverage if you're Micah Parsons and his representation to just sit tight. You got time on your side. And we'll see what happens.
We will see indeed. I suspect that the Steelers will keep TJ. I'm interested to see how this Aaron Rodgers things unfold. But in the meantime, Rand, let's take a quick break, and we'll come back. We'll talk about a young quarterback, one who can't stay healthy, and Anthony Richardson, what that means for his future and for the Colts. We'll do that right after this break. All right, Rand. Let's go to Indianapolis and talk about the quarterback situation there. We've been talking about Anthony Richardson a lot, in part because he hasn't quite turned into the player that we had all hoped he would be, just because of inconsistency. Nothing really more than that, except for the injuries. And his surgically repaired throwing shoulder started to give him some soreness during OTAs in late May, so he's going to rest that thing. Hopefully he'll be ready for training camp. And I had, our buddy Rick Spielman mention this to me throughout the process of evaluating players. When guys are hurt in college, typically they're hurt in the pros, and that appears to be the situation with Anthony Richardson. I don't know what the workaround is, because you're invested in this young man. He's a top 5 pick, but where do you go from here if you're the Colts and trying to figure out what your quarterback situation is going to be for the next 1 to 5 years?
Well, this is why they signed Daniel Jones and made the investment in Daniel Jones, because they knew that this could be a possibility. And unfortunate for him, like, this is just what his career has been. You go back to the University of Florida, and just when you started to get excited about what Anthony Richardson can bring, it was a hamstring, it was a knee, it was an ankle. So it was always something in terms of injuries. And so now we're right there, again with this, the shoulder. His shoulder injury that happened to him his rookie year actually came against the Titans in a game in Indianapolis. And so, those type of things, the bones and stuff, like, you can't do anything about that. But it's like, now you're in a position for him that you may want to start tweaking his offseason preparation, and what is he doing, and is he throwing too much? And what is his lifting regimen like? If you've ever seen him in person, he has the athletic build. He has, that rocked up frame. And maybe it's time to switch from banging weights to doing more mobility and more stretching thing to keep those muscles and ligaments loose.
So if you're the general manager and this happens over the summer and he has the history of getting injured, have you had the conversations, or do you plan on having the conversations when everyone's back in the building in July and August? Talking to the scouts about, okay, before you guys hit the road, let's be extra vigilant about looking at these quarterbacks, or are we too early in the process for that?
No, I think as GM, I think you put it on yourself to start that process. I think it's too early to put it on the scouts. And listen, the scouts read everything. They see everything. They watch With the First Pick podcast, so they know what we're talking about. And so they're going to do the work. And the one thing I've learned in the scouting community is when you go into an off season, or you go into a season of scouting with a position that is a weakness, then you tend to over scout, you tend to overgrade people, and it puts a completely different value, because that position is such a position of need that you kind of tend to run some guys up on the board just to be safe. And you never know what's going to be facing you when it's time to pull that card off the board. So I would leave the scouts alone for now. Let them continue to do their summer scouting. Let them continue to do, their preseason stuff, so you can get the information. But as a GM, I would grab my top 2 lieutenants and say, hey, probably time to jump down in the bunker and into our situation room, and let's watch these quarterbacks and have a good feel for them as we enter the fall.
And to your point, Chris Ballard went out and got Daniel Jones for that reason. So it gives you a little buffer in terms of not having to overreact or overpay for a quarterback right now. You can roll with Daniel Jones. They drafted Riley Leonard in the 5th round. So you have a little wiggle room as you try to navigate 2025. Hopefully AR5 can get healthy and stay healthy. But that has yet to be the case over at least the course of the season. Speaking of injuries, let's go to Atlanta and Kirk Cousins, who a year ago was the starter, and 10 months ago was the starter without knowing that they were going to draft Michael Penix Jr., and now Michael Penix Jr. is the starter, and we got to figure out where Kirk Cousins lands. And it feels like right now, Rand, it's either going to be one of two places. Either he's going to be the backup in Atlanta, and they're just going to pay him, and they seem to be okay with that, or you have to wait for perhaps, unfortunately, a training camp injury or an early season injury to a quarterback that's potentially a starter elsewhere, and then make that deal happen. And if that happens, I'm guessing the big question is, all right, how are we going to split up paying Kirk Cousins if we're the Falcons and whoever team B ends up being?
So I want to start from a different perspective, right? Okay. Because as we can see on the tagline, it says, what's going on with Kirk Cousins? There's nothing going on with Kirk Cousins, right? This is all out of his control. He has nothing to do with this. And at this point, it comes down to the Atlanta Falcons and what they're going to ultimately decide about his future. And again, we talk about it all the time on this show. It's easy to say, hey, we should trade this guy, or we want to trade this guy, but you have to have a partner. And right now, the Falcons may not just have a partner. Now, I'm sure they had conversations with the Steelers, maybe, during this Aaron Rodgers saga, but now Aaron Rodgers has a home. He's in Pittsburgh. So that doesn't leave Atlanta with very many options. And like you talked about, they've already budgeted for carrying Kirk Cousins' number, throughout this season. So it's not going to bother them per se. to, have him on the roster in terms of a cap standpoint. So they already have that budgeted. But again, there's other extenuating things that come up. If you do have a trade partner, what's that going to look like? I'm sure the pick it will be a hard pick, but it's going to be a conditional pick based on how much he plays. And then how high is the pick going to be? Are they going to have to pay down some of that? Will Atlanta pay down some of that? We don't know. We're not privy to those conversations. But to say what's going on with Kirk Cousins, this isn't a Kirk Cousins problem or issue. This is more of an Atlanta Falcons issue right now.
Exactly. And just so we're clear, any team that trades for Cousins is going to take on his guaranteed salary for 2025, which is $27.5 million, and then potentially future guaranteed money if his contract isn't restructured. So those, again, that's complicating this situation in terms of what that means for his future. Let me ask you this, Rand. So you talked about maybe the Steelers checked in with the Falcons, but it feels like the conversation has been almost all about Aaron Rodgers since the draft in terms of the Pittsburgh connection there. All else being equal, and we'll just assume that Kurt and Aaron are equal health coming off that Achilles injury, even though Kurt's happened later than Aaron's did. But if you're the Steelers, who would you rather have, taking everything into account, the age, the off-field stuff, the mobility on the field, all that other stuff? If you're the Steelers, who makes the most sense? Would you rather have Kirk Cousins or roll with Aaron Rodgers?
I think it's one of those things where you do the pros and the cons, because there's going to be pros and cons with it both ways. But if I'm making a decision, you got to roll with the future Hall of Famer, because you've seen him do it on a big stage. And hey, listen, every team that Kirk Cousins has ever went to, probably with the exception of Washington, has been willing to pay him and pay him for his services. So you can love him or hate him, but Kirk Cousins has won games in this league. However, the big problem for Kirk Cousins has been winning in big games. And so that's always been the issue. And you've seen Aaron Rodgers, win those big games. He has a Lombardi to his name. And so you have to err on the side of that. Now, again, probably if you can mix and match, you would take Kirk Cousins probably off field, quote unquote, home life, if you will, over Aaron Rodgers. But again, like even some of that, we've never heard Aaron Rodgers' teammates say they hate him, or they dislike him. We've never heard that. It's just Aaron Rodgers is an outspoken person about issues and topics that the rest of us won't touch or don't touch, publicly. And it just ruffles some feathers. So I don't know. Again, it doesn't feel like a Pittsburgh Steeler type of guy just based off of the history of the organization. But if you're comparing these two, you got to always err on the side of the future Hall of Famer and a guy that you've seen win big games.
And that's the thing, that last word there, win. Because if they start winning, no one will care what Aaron Rodgers says or when he says it. That's typically how this thing works throughout the history of sports, well before Aaron Rodgers graced the earth. All right, let's take another quick break here. When we come back, going to come up with some landing spots for just released Jaire Alexander, formerly of the Green Bay Packers, and then cornerback Jalen Ramsey, who's still with the Dolphins, but he may not be for much longer. We'll talk about all that right after this. All right, Rand, let's talk about Jaire Alexander, just released by the Green Bay Packers. And the issue with Jaire is not on the field. It's the fact that he can't stay on the field. He's battled injuries the last few years. I think he's played 7 games in each 24 and 23 seasons, and he is now free to sell his wares wherever. And I'll ask you this. When he's healthy, one of the best cornerbacks in the league, what makes the most sense for him in terms of his next landing spot? One thing else to keep in mind, week 18, I believe, the 2023 season, he was suspended 1 game for conduct detrimental, or whatever they wanted to call it. I think he was rubbing some people the wrong way in the organization. But in general, there's a lot to like about him. Where do you think it makes the most sense for him in terms of landing spots?
I think the number one spot for me right now would be the Saints, because you have a young Kool-Aid McKinstry that's starting there, and I'm pretty sure Lante Taylor is the other corner that'll be penciled in there. So that makes the most sense now. And I'm sure we'll talk about it here in a second when we mention Jalen Ramsey. The advantage that Jaire has is that he's free to negotiate now. And for Jalen Ramsey, it's about finding a home, finding a package deal that both teams can, agree to. So I think, like you said, Jaire is talented. I think we all know that. However, the big issue for Jaire has been, the health, and then you add in some of the personality stuff. You mentioned, the one game suspension. This guy made himself a team captain for a game just because he just went out there. But that just shows you, his personality. And you can watch some of his interviews and you can hear, the quirkiness to him. But man, when he's on the field and he's healthy, he's one of the better corners in the league. So he just has to, figure that part out. But I think from a just standpoint of a team that needs a corner the most, I think New Orleans Saints would be a team there.
Yeah, they're a young team that certainly has quarterback situations as well, but they do have some needs in the secondary. One of the teams I came up with, and this segues nicely into our next talking point here. What about the Miami Dolphins? Because obviously Jalen Ramsey, it feels like he's played his last snap for the Dolphins. Would Jaire, who's a different type player, he's not as big or as physical as Jalen is, would he make sense there? Because they still have needs in the secondary. Those needs are about to get bigger if Jalen Ramsey ends up elsewhere.
No, I agree, and I think he does fit, and I think I'm just judging from a personality standpoint. I think has the type of personality that I think Mike McDaniels can work with. Now, here's the trick. Here's the trick. If you're saying Jaire Alexander to Miami, who is Green Bay's head coach? Matt LaFleur. Mm-hmm. Who's the defensive coordinator? Jeff Hafley. McDaniels worked with both of those guys at different stops. And so I'm pretty sure if they were having that conversation, Miami could get a little bit more intel than most when it comes to what's it like managing Jaire on a day-to-day basis. So if you see that move happen, then you know that on some level, Matt LaFleur and Jeff Hafley signed off on Jaire.
I don't know. Do you have a relationship with Mike LaFleur? Do you know him from your time travels?
Yeah. I know both of the LaFleur brothers work with Jeff Hafley in San Francisco as well. So that's the crew. That's the crew. That's a part of that Shanahan tree. Right. They've all worked, from under there, and there's no bigger disciple of the Shanahan tree than Mike McDaniel. So again, from a personality standpoint, I think it fits. And if I could go back when I'm talking about Jaire to the Saints, like the Saints would be a good fit because you still have Tyrann Mathieu there, who's the bona fide leader of that room. And I don't think anybody's going to come in and disrupt that, or Tyrann. I don't believe he'll allow that to happen. So it could be a good one-year landing spot for Jaire to come in, get himself together, prove that he could be a good teammate and, play within a structure, and then maybe hit it big after that.
And by the way, Honey Badger is a great example of someone who coming out had some off-field issues he had to concern himself with, has been a model citizen and player, played at an extremely high level since arriving in the NFL. So just because you make a mistake and name yourself team captain, for example, that doesn't mean your career has to be over. It's just something you learn from. So I think that's a good fit, as you note there. All right, let's talk about Jalen Ramsey, currently on the roster in Miami. And if you missed it, we talked to GM Les Snead of the Rams, and that's on the podcast. We did that on Monday. He acquired Jalen Ramsey when they won the Super Bowl. And there's a chance that he ends up back in L.A. I have a list of landing spots here, Ram, but I'll let you start with your favorite landing spot for Jalen Ramsey should he end up leaving the Dolphins.
Well, I'll say this much. If you're Jalen, the money part, I'm not going to speak for him from a financial standpoint, but I would say on the surface, the money part shouldn't be an issue. I'm looking at what does Jalen want at this point? Right? Like, do you want to win a championship? Like, what is Jalen's goals? What's left for Jalen, to accomplish? And I just look at a team that gives him the best opportunity to do that. And I would say either Detroit or I would say back to the Rams. And again, I could easily, drop him in that bucket to the Saints as well. But do the Saints have enough to win right now? And if that's what's important to Jalen. So I would just say Detroit and the Rams if he's looking to truly go out on top and win the championship.
Yeah, two other sneaky teams, actually three other sneaky teams that I sort of like in the AFC. The Ravens don't necessarily need a lot of depth, but having Ramsey there as not a part-time player, but a guy who doesn't have to play every single snap, that's intriguing to me. The Bengals desperately need help everywhere in defense, so that makes some sense. But then you're sort of putting yourself behind the Ravens in that division because it's just Joe Burrow in that offense right now. And then what do you think about this, Rand, before we take a break here? What about the Chiefs?
Yeah. Now here's what I'll say with the Chiefs, because I haven't looked at their cap situation. Can they fit all of that under?
Yeah.
Will that require Jalen Ramsey to restructure? Now, here's what I'll say about the Cincinnati one, and I know we got to take a break. Jalen Ramsey's agent is David Mulugheta. And David was representing T. Higgins in the deal to Cincinnati, at that time. So what is that relationship like? Because that's going to, have a, conversation between the Bengals and Jalen's representation. So we don't know what that relationship is going to look like, because if you're seeking a trade, there comes a point where your team allows you and your agent to reach out to other teams. And, I don't know where, David's relationship is with the Bengals organization, and would he be willing to reach out to that organization to get something done?
That's a good point. No, that's right. That's a good point, because, as professional as agents and teams are, I'm sure sometimes there's some animosity when you're doing a deal that takes a while to get done on either side, or maybe both sides. All right, let's take another quick break here. When we come back, going to talk about the only position that matters, the running back position. See what James Cook is up to, and Nick Chubb in his new home in Houston, and we'll talk about that right after this. All right, Rand, let's talk about the Lord's position, the running back position, which you made famous. Some say you invented the position on Carthon's corner, probably. All right, let's talk about James Cook. He did show up for minicamp, and you sort of hinted before the show that he had to show up, I would imagine, to avoid the fines. But he is looking to get paid, and understandably so. He's a big part of that offense that runs through, of course, Josh Allen. But I'll start here. Saquon Barkley makes $20 million a year on average. He's number one. Christian McCaffrey is at 19. Derrick Henry's at 15. And on down the list you can go here. How far down this list, and thanks, Producer Stryker, for throwing up this graphic, how far down this list do we have to go until Brandon Beane feels comfortable giving James Cook a new deal?
And that's the perfect question. And if you don't mind, Producer Stryker, if you could just leave this up, and let's look at this list, right? So let's just be honest. He doesn't fit in 1 through 6 there. Now, the only one I could see to have an argument, because they are similar style runners, is where the Aaron Jones comp comes in. And he's a different style runner than James Conner and Montgomery and Ramondre Stevens. So I'm pretty sure if you're James Cook's representation, you're probably shooting for that Josh Jacobs, which I would say no, but you're looking in that Aaron Jones things. Now and I'm good. We don't need the graphic anymore, Stryker. I appreciate you leaving it up for me. But here's where my argument, and where it gets a little weird for me in terms of talking about James Cook. Like, James Cook is great for this offense, and he brings a level of dynamism to it that it needs, right, from the running back position. However, when you're looking at just the sheer numbers, he was just a shade over 1,000 yards last year. And I think if you do the average, it's about 63.6 yards a game, right, which is fine. Like, he got to 1,000 yards. But then if you look at Saquon Barkley, Saquon averaged 125 yards rushing per game. That's a huge disparity in terms of the production. So now how do you pay that? So I'm pretty sure that that's where the hangup is for Buffalo now, is like, where does he really fall, and what is he really bringing, like, to really separate himself, in this organization? Now, again, we talk about it. Everyone's going to always say that you can always find a running back, and I don't believe that to be true. However, you have to weigh the option of, do you want to pay James Cook 10 to 12 million a year, or do you want to give Ray Davis more touches? That's just a question for Buffalo.
All right, so you be Brandon Beane and I'll be James Cook's agent. And you mentioned the Aaron Jones number around 10 million. I would counter and say James Cook is 5 years younger than Aaron Jones, at least. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I'm assuming that's about right. In terms of the only 63 yards or so per game, I would say, well, that's the offense you and Joe Brady are running. And it starts with a lot of mouths to feed. And, of course, you have Josh Allen. But he can certainly do more if you want him to do more. I want to make 15 to 18 million, whatever the number may be. What's your counter to that, if that's the conversation?
So if that was the argument, and you're saying that this is the offense we run, so my counter argument would be, so if this is the offense we run, like, we don't really need to pay you $15 million a year if we're getting 63 yards a game, whether we could do that by committee or we have that, at another back. And at that point, I would just say, hey, look, let's get through this year. Let's table the conversation, for now, because obviously we're so far apart, in these talks that it's not going to be productive. These negotiations are going to automatically get contentious just because you have points to prove, they have points to prove.
Right.
And this is why you try so hard to keep it from being public. Right, because you don't need the extra gas on the fire that's already brewing inside your building. You could try to keep family business, but it's one of those situations where if you're at 15, I'm at, because if I'm trying to get to 10, I'm not starting at 10, right? Because if you start at 10, you're only going up. So I'm pretty sure their first offer was in that 8, 8.5, maybe 9, range. And if you're at 15, then what's the meeting point? 12? Well, no, that's north of where we are. And so that's why I've always believed in walking into these negotiations with your walkaway price, knowing where you're like, we're absolutely not going to go there. And if you're at your walkaway price, you got to stay steadfast to it and just be prepared to walk away. I mean, let's look at it. And I just almost, got fined here on CBS. Just almost let a word slip out, my mouth. But I mean, the Giants let Saquon walk. Try that on for size.
Yeah. Joe Shane just had to deal with that. So I'll just say this. This is what my father-in-law told me. When you go into the car dealership, you can't be afraid to walk away. You don't have to come out of there with a car. So we'll see how it goes. I'm sure James Cook is incredibly frustrated, and I get it. And he probably doesn't want to hear the conversation that, hey, let's just table this for now, because he's like, well, I'm putting my body on the line. But he's not the first one to go through this. So we'll see how it sorts itself out. James, just so we're clear, I'm team player. Rand is team management. We can tell that already. That's how he's rolling. All right, let's talk about a guy that has given no one trouble ever, I don't think. You talk to Browns fans. He's one of the favorite players in Browns history. Nick Chubb didn't re-up with the team, had that serious knee injury a few years ago against the Steelers. He is now on a 1-year, $2.5 million deal with the Houston Texans. Man, I love that fit because, number one, you got Joe Mixon. Number two, they drafted Woody Marks out of USC. And number three, Nick Chubb is who Nick Chubb is. And if you're getting 60% of Nick Chubb in this offense that's supposed to be as good as it should be, I feel great about that, Rand.
Yeah, I love this fit as well. And the number one thing I'll say is Nick Chubb, to me, feels like the DeMeco Ryans of the offense. If you go back to what DeMeco was as a player, he was essentially a version of Nick Chubb, a man of very few words, a man of action that just did his job at a very high level and led the entire way. And I think this is such a good personality fit for this team because, I mean, think about that, a 1-2 punch of Joe Mixon and Nick Chubb. And you're getting a rested Nick Chubb. So, man, I mean, I love this fit. And I think it's, if he's healthy or close to being healthy, like good luck to everybody in the AFC South, because you're going to have to, I mean, when they turn around and start handing this ball off, and then, oh, by the way, they're going to be able to have a play action game off of it. Like I said, good luck.
Yep. New offensive coordinator Nick Caley has replaced the other offense coordinator that didn't see eye to eye with CJ Stroud, it sounds like. The one thing I want to ask quickly before we take another break here and do some mailbag questions, should we be at all concerned about this arm soreness for CJ Stroud? It's June. Like, why is his arm hurting right now?
Again, man, these are these long off seasons. This is what long off seasons bring. You're a quarterback. Quarterbacks are trained. I think we saw a clip where Cam Ward said he's up at 5 a.m. doing whatever it is. These guys go off. They get with these quarterback coaches, and they are just throwing the ball around. And so at some point, you have to learn how to tailor your offense to, like Shaq used to say. Shaq said, now I wouldn't recommend this, but Shaq said he never came into training camp 100%. Because the only way you could go was down. Everything for him was a build-up to get through the season. I think these guys, especially these young guys, they need to learn how to manage their body better. And some of these guys, again, all they're concerned with is just throwing, right? Throwing. And he just has to give his body a rest. And it's just a part of it. He's got to learn that.
And by the way, head coach DeMeco Ryans, who you know quite well, said today that CJ will throw. He's not worried about it. So if DeMeco's not worried about it, then I won't be worried about it. So hopefully CJ is 100% healthy as we go into the offseason. And we're going to take a quick break here. And when we come back, we're going to do a little mailbag, answer some of your questions right after this break. All right, Ram, before we get to the mailbag question, we ended the last segment talking about D'Amico Ryans, the Texans head coach, and you want to add something as we get into this segment about D'Amico.
Yeah, I just want to give D'Amico a quick shout out. He just delivered his first sermon this past Sunday. He's a strong and devout member of the Church of Christ, and he just delivered his sermon. It was really impressive. So I just want to say shout out to D'Amico, man. Keep leading, and you're just an impressive dude, man. You walk the walk and of everything that you believe in. So shout out to you.
Yeah, like I told you during the break when we talked to some of these young guys around the league, it's crazy how good they are at communicating. And, growing up in the 80s like I did, when you had a coach, it wasn't a lot of talking going on other than don't get any water and keep running sprints. And now the way these people communicate with these young men is incredibly impressive. So that's great about D'Amico. I'm glad to hear that. All right, Producer Striker, let's get into some of these 5-star reviews. This first one came by way of Apple Podcasts. And by the way, if you leave us a 5-star review and a quote, Ashton Genty and Nick Nash, the wide receiver out of San Jose State, are out of the same conference. Why wasn't there any hype on Nick Nash, and why was the Triple Crown winner undrafted? And by Triple Crown, he led the FBS in receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. Asking as a Falcons fan and wondering about his potential. So Nick Nash did go undrafted. He was signed as an undrafted free agent, ran by the Atlanta Falcons. And here's the thing. He ran a 4.57. That's not great. He was at the Shrine Bowl, and I watched some of the practices there. And he struggles to create separation. He does have a big catch radius. He did have some focus drops over the course of the season at San Jose State. But I think the 4.57 and the fact that he's going to be 26 in a few weeks probably hinders him. And I'll just ask you this as the evaluator and the GM. If you struggle to get open against non-Power 4 teams, it's fair to assume that you're going to struggle to get open against NFL cornerbacks. Is that correct?
Correct. And then at the end of the day, what you've done in college, yes, it weighs, but a lot of the evaluation process is a projection. And like you said, at 26 years old, like how much better is this guy going to actually get? And is that worth a draft pick? Would you rather have a guy in the 7th round that you can develop, or a guy that he is what he is and he's not going to get any better that you're probably going to be looking to, replace in the following year? And look, guys, like I've always said this about college players. It is perfectly okay to be a good college football player and not play in the NFL. That is fine. And that doesn't take any away from Nick Nash and what he's done and what he was able to accomplish. But some people are just good college football players, and that's where it is.
And the other thing I'll add quickly is that when you talk to wide receivers coaches and you guys are going to these draft meetings, it's great to love Nick Nash, and you can certainly love him. But when you're wide receiver 5 and you don't play special teams, that's almost a non-starter, right?
Absolutely.
All right, there you go. That's all we need. Gave us a Drew Rosenhaus one-word answer there, Striker. Next question. All right, here we go. This is from YouTube comments. Big Money Monkey 1. I guess Big Money Monkey 0 was taken. Is Shedeur going to recover from the fall to the 5th round and start on Cleveland's roster? And if he does, how well do you think he'll do in this league? Because listen, man, 2 months ago he was a top 32 pick. So that the evaluation doesn't change. What's your take on Shedeur's path to a starting job and then how he might perform once he gets it?
I think so far he's handled everything properly. He's just put his head down and he's just worked. You hadn't heard too much from anything of all those, quote unquote concerns and anonymous concerns and things that came out. To my knowledge, you hadn't seen anything, come out of Cleveland on that. And so all I've seen on him at this point are throws that he's made and he's looked apart. Now we'll see what happens when the bullets start flying in the preseason, but can he recover from this? I think he can, and I think he will. I think he's in a position where he can succeed. He just has to continue to do his part, and that's keep his head down and work.
Yep, that's all you can do at this point. Absolutely. All right, this is from YouTube commenter, Not a Real YouTube Account 799. One of my favorite not real YouTube accounts. Will Travis Hunter actually play any games on both sides of the ball? And I'll just qualify that by saying in the same game. So will we see him do wide receiver and cornerback in the same game? My guess is yes. What's your guess?
Yes, and we're going to see that week 1. It's going to happen. That's why you take this guy. He's a unicorn. He's an anomaly. And like we talked about, let's not forget we're in sports and entertainment. And so people want to see history. They want to see the great thing. But people also want to see car crashes as well, And so people are going to show up to these games to see him do it. And there's going to be the haters on the side that want to see him not do well at doing it. So people are going to come to these games to see. And James Gladstone and Liam Cohen are going to give the people what they want to see. I think you'll see it in week 1.
All right. Next question, and this is a fair question. If you're a Giants fan or if you're a team that needed a quarterback and didn't get one, with the 25th pick, they took Jackson Dart out of Ole Miss. Can he be a franchise quarterback? And I guess the follow-up question is, how long do we have to wait to know whether he, in fact, can be that person?
So our guy, Guerrero Cubano, I'll say this. When you're using the term franchise quarterback, like that, I know it's a big term. We throw that term around a lot. But let's be serious here. Like, God only made so many of those people. And so there are I'm just guessing off the top of my head, there are 4 or 5 guys in the league right now, maybe 6 that we would consider franchise quarterbacks. I don't see him as a franchise quarterback, but I think within the right system, he's a guy you can win with. I'll use for my argument's sake, there are a litany of people who don't see Brock Purdy as a franchise quarterback. But all you've ever seen Brock Purdy do is win football games and lead his team to Super Bowl. So, that goes, into it with me. I don't see Jackson Dart as a quote unquote franchise quarterback, but I see him as a quarterback that you can win with.
And by the way, if your future is a game manager in Kyle Shanahan's system and all you do is win to go to Super Bowls, I'll happily take on that burden. And I'm sure Jackson Dart would too if the Brian Daboll replaces Shanahan in that little Mad Libs there. All right, next up here from Kevin McFlurry 5198, does Ashton Jeanty have potential to win Offensive Rookie of the Year? And my immediate response would be, who's going to give him any competition? Maybe Travis Hunter? What do you think?
Yeah, I think he right now, as we look at it, I think he's in the driver's seat, of it. But there's always that one anomaly that comes out of left field that you weren't expecting to see. No one expected to see Brock Bowers come out of left field and do what he's done, as a tight end, let alone, so I think he does. And I think because he's coming in as RB1 and in a Chip Kelly system where the defense is going to be spread laterally and there are going to be some creases and all he has to do is hit it and get it. So I think he does have a shot at it.
All right. I've got 90 seconds here. I want to ask you this last one. I don't know if there's a 90-second answer in here, but I'm actually curious about this from Rob Dillon. Why are teams struggling to come to terms with their second-round pick?
And I love that question. And I think it's because you saw the 1 second-round deal that's been done become fully guaranteed. And agents have been angling for these fully guaranteed deals at the top of the second. So now that we've seen one, then that's what teams are fighting against now with these agents. These agents want more guaranteed deals, and they're going to want them more at the top. So good luck.
So you're basically mad at the agent who pulled this off if you're the other agents trying to get it done. All right, let's squeeze one more question here quickly. Does Matthew Golden, the first-round pick of the Packers, does he lead Green Bay in yards and become wide receiver 1 in 2025?
I think it's a strong chance just because of the skill set and the system. But there are a ton of receivers in that room right now. So let's just let it go through the preseason a little bit and see how that whole thing shapes out. But there is a chance, yes.
There is a ton of receivers in that room, and it's funny that they complain about not having receivers in Green Bay. All right, Rand, good job by you. Adequate job by me. You can check out With the First Pick wherever you get your podcast. Scan that QR code to check out Carthon's Corner. We're going to do it all month long.